Hello there. Today we are reacting to an apologist video that tries ever so hard to debunk Ricky Gervais's well-known argument about science and religion. The argument being attacked is a very simple one. Gervais points out that scientific knowledge is reproducible. Destroy all of the scientific books, and scientists will eventually rediscover the same facts because nature doesn't change. They're just discovering what was already there. But destroy all of the religious texts, and you won't get the same books back. To be clear, this doesn't mean that religion in some form or in many different forms wouldn't come back, but you wouldn't get the same religions with the same texts and the exact same stories. Different cultures would invent different religions and different stories out of whole cloth. That's actually a pretty solid epistemological point about the nature of empirical knowledge itself. And it's the kind of argument that really deserves a serious response. But what we're going to get instead is a lot of historical revisionism. Some of it is just sloppy. Some of it is genuinely offensive. And a lot of it confuses correlation with causation in ways that would embarrass any first-year college student. So let's get into it.
So there's this popular clip of Ricky Gervais that reappears every now and then at the hands of usually some atheist promoting account on social media because they actually seem to think that this is a good argument. It's hard to blame them too at the same time. They probably received the same dreadful public education that I did, which seemed to think that prior to the French Revolution, everything was just prehistoric and barbaric. So anyways, in the clip, Mr. Gervais confidently asserts this.
If we take something like any fiction, in any holy book, in any other fiction, and destroyed it, okay, in 1,000 years' time, that wouldn't come back just as it was. Whereas if we took every science book, right, and every fact, and destroyed them all, in 1,000 years, they'd all be back, because all the same tests would be the same result.
That's good. That's really good.
So right off the bat, I just have to point out that he doesn't seem to be capable or willing of pronouncing Ricky Gervais's name correctly. And I don't normally get too up in my feels about pronunciations, but it is very easy to find Ricky Gervais's name pronounced on, I don't know, 1,000 different YouTube channels and other resources as well. And yet he keeps saying Ricky Gervais. And admittedly, it looks like it's a name of some sort of French origin, but Ricky Gervais doesn't pronounce his name Ricky Gervais. He pronounces it Ricky Gervais. And maybe that is pedantic. Maybe it's just too picky, and that would be fair if you felt that way. But when you see the nature of the rest of his arguments, I think that it is sort of telling that he can't even be bothered to figure out how to pronounce the name of a very famous individual. But more importantly, let's look at what he's already done here. He's framed disagreement with his thesis as a result of dreadful public education. You see, if you already agree with Gervais, it's not because you've thought it through, it's because you were poorly educated. And that, of course, is a preemptive ad hominem. It hasn't made a single argument yet. He's already decided that people who disagree with him are just ignorant. So keep that framing in mind.
Now, the thing about this claim is that we don't really have to speculate about what would or could happen because history largely tells us. It tells us that the path to this modern, industrialized, mechanized, and scientifically literate civilization that Ricky seems to take for granted as if it was inevitable was extremely unlikely. It's the consequence of a crazy progression of thought, political stability, specialization, and educational institutions in which the presence of Christianity wasn't just a correlation, it was indispensable. If Christianity had never appeared, it never would have happened. And it isn't hard to prove. The first thing I'd want to say to someone like Mr. Gervais, who's a true believer in the inevitability of progress, is let's actually imagine your scenario, but let's be more thorough.
So here's his central thesis, stated plainly. The path to modern science was extremely unlikely. Christianity was indispensable to it, and without Christianity, it never would have happened. Now, first of all, I have to point out that these are not specific claims that Ricky Gervais was making. And Ricky Gervais was talking about religion in general. But I guess Brian is feeling himself today and decided that he doesn't just think that religion is instrumental in bringing these things about, but he is happy to take on the extra burden of proof that comes with trying to claim that Christianity itself is indispensable to these achievements. And ladies and gentlemen, that is an extraordinary claim, and extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And I don't think we're going to see much of it. He's not just saying that Christianity helped. He's saying that it was necessary, that without it, we'd still be in the dark. He hasn't proven that yet, and trust me, he's not going to, but he's stated it as if it were obvious. But let's see if the evidence actually supports it.
So let's not just destroy every religious and then every scientific book. Let's erase that knowledge entirely and everything it's produced from the memory of humanity. Let's take us back to that primitive state of nature. You have no technology, no civilization. Your community is extremely small. You have no infrastructure or safety net. Whatever you know is the collective knowledge of your closest 20 friends and relatives who are just as illiterate and uneducated as you. In that condition, you're in constant danger of starvation and violence, even from within your own tribe, exposure to the elements or attack from neighboring tribes or even wildlife. Everything you do needs to be devoted to surviving a long list of very immediate threats. I remember when my wife and I were first married, there was this reality show that would come on TV every now and then. I don't know if it's still around, but it was called Naked and Afraid, in which they tried to recreate this exact premise as much as possible, where they took two people, took everything away, including their clothes, and just dropped them somewhere in the wilderness. And they had to try to survive, I think it was for like 14 days or something like that. And even that concept doesn't really do justice to what we're trying to imagine here, because at least they're educated and experienced, they're trained survivalists. But even with all the advantages that they have as modern scientific people, they often wouldn't be able to survive the 14 days and they'd have to get rescued by the producers. That's how vulnerable a person in that primitive state is. So how do you go from that to the first steps towards civilization?
So this is the state of nature argument. Primitive humans were vulnerable. Survival was difficult. Specialization was hard to sustain. And none of that is actually wrong. It's a reasonable sketch of the challenges facing early human communities. But notice what he's doing here. He's setting up a problem without specifying how Christianity solves it. He's describing the difficulty of the leap from hunter-gatherer existence to civilization writ large. But Christianity didn't appear until roughly 2,000 years ago. In civilizations, including very sophisticated ones, existed thousands of years before that. He wants us to believe that Christianity was absolutely necessary for these advancements, and yet Christianity, when it comes in relation to civilization as a whole, is a fairly late player in the game. So whatever Christianity contributed, it can't be the solution to the original primitive humans problem. That problem was already solved multiple times by people who had no idea that Christianity would ever exist in multiple places all over the world before Christianity ever came into being. He's building toward an argument, but the foundation is already shaky as hell.
How does one person, at least in a tribal scenario like that, propose to everyone else that they'd like to devote their time to rational thought and technological development? In other words, to specialize. Like, what if you were time traveled into a scenario like that and got in tight with a primitive tribe and you say to them, hey guys, if it's okay with you, I'd like to try to develop something called metal. We'll be able to use it for like weapons and cookware, but it requires a lot of time mining ore from rocks and then refining it through a complicated process with fire. But if we persist long enough, I'm sure I'll be able to basically reshape something as hard as rock into whatever we want. And while I figure that out, you're all going to have to work extra hard to feed and care for my needs, because I'm not going to be able to help out with all those kinds of things. What do you think the rest of the hunter-gatherers are going to say to you in that scenario? They'll tell you to shut up and get back to work. When you start to appreciate the difficulty here and the near miraculous succession that is needed to make those kinds of civilizational strides, it becomes easier to understand why, even though Native Americans were on this continent for something like 10 to 30,000 years.
So the specialization argument is fine as far as it goes. Yes, someone who wants to spend their time developing metallurgy needs a community willing to support them. That's a real sociological constraint on the development of technology itself. But this argument proves way too much. It explains why specialization is hard, but it doesn't explain why Christianity specifically is what enables it. It doesn't say jack shit about Christianity in particular. Specialization happened in Mesopotamia. It happened in Egypt. It happened in China. It happened in the Indus Valley. It happened in Mesoamerica. And none of those early civilizations were in any way, shape, or form Christian. They all managed to support artisans, scribes, astronomers, and all forms of different engineers without the benefit of the church, especially without the benefit of the Christian church in any way, shape, or form. The argument that he's making here is compatible with Christianity playing a role, but it doesn't establish at all that Christianity was the cause. In fact, the examples that he's giving refute the idea that Christianity would in any way be related to the cause.
They never traversed those critical steps. They were still using rocks as tools and implements when they had European contact. They never managed to start using metal. They never managed to domesticate animals. They never managed to stabilize a language long enough or widespread enough in order to make that leap into a written form. Some claim that human beings have anatomically been around in the same basic biological structure we currently have for hundreds of thousands of years, but it was only in the past 6,000 years or so that some of us made the great leap towards civilization, where labor became organized enough that some members of the community could spend their time in specialized pursuits to work on harebrained ideas like trying to get wild animals to be docile and obedient, or to magically turn rocks into metal, or plow a field on the off chance that you can make it grow exactly the kind of vegetation that is edible that you want, none of which was guaranteed to work because nobody had ever done it before.
Okay, we need to stop here. This video as a whole is a bit of a background for you, is something that I was not planning to do this weekend. I had already recorded a bunch of other stuff and I've been editing other stuff, and I did not have it on my agenda to be doing this weekend. But when I saw this video, I was like, okay, I have to react to this. And then specifically when I saw this portion of the video, I was just overwhelmed by the cultural ignorance that he is proudly putting on display. This is where the video goes from sloppy to genuinely offensive. I don't want to accuse him of anything personally in terms of his motivations, but this is deeply offensive to people that don't look like him and don't come from the same part of the world as he does. He says that Native Americans, he makes this bold claim that Native Americans never traversed those critical steps, that they were still using rocks as tools when Europeans arrived, that they never used metal, never domesticated animals, never developed written language. Every single one of those claims is false. It's not just false around the edges. It's the kind of false that you can solve with a 30-second Google search. In order to put out this level of ignorance, you either have to be willfully ignorant, like you just don't want to admit what the simple truth is, or there needs to be something more malevolent in your intentions. And I don't think that he is malevolent per se, but he certainly is not making a good name for himself at all with these horrible ethnocentric claims that cannot be validated at all because they are all demonstrably false. Let's start with metallurgy. Mesoamerican civilizations worked extensively with copper, gold, silver, and bronze. Copper bells, axes, and ornaments, they were all produced across a wide range of cultures, including the Aztec and their predecessors. The Andean cultures, the Inca and the civilizations that came before them, they were sophisticated metal workers. They worked with copper, bronze, gold, and silver. The Chavin and Moche cultures in Peru were producing metal objects centuries before European contact. But he has the balls to tell us that Native Americans didn't have metallurgy and they were just using stone tools. That's the only thing that they had available to them because they had just never advanced beyond that point. Now let's look at animal domestication. The Inca domesticated llamas and alpacas, not just for burden carrying either. They were bred for wool and meat as well. Guinea pigs were domesticated as a food source. In Mesoamerica, turkeys and dogs were domesticated. The assertion that Native Americans never managed to domesticate animals is just flatly wrong. It's so wrong that it's stupid. Now, if he actually cared to do some research on this, there are some fascinating reasons as to why North and South American native peoples did not have domesticated animals on the same scale that other people did around the world. And a lot of this comes down to the natural fauna that was in North and South America at the time. There just weren't as many animals in those regions or as many species in those regions that were amenable to being domesticated or turned into livestock. But to claim that they just never accomplished this is just outright, blatantly ignorant. And what about written language? He claims that they didn't have it. But the Maya had a fully developed writing system, a true logosyllabic script, capable of recording history, astronomy, mathematics, poetry, and prophecy. It was sophisticated enough that it took modern scholars decades to fully decode it. The Aztec used a mixed pictographic and logographic system. The Zapotec had a writing system that predates the Maya. To say that no Native American culture managed to stabilize a language long enough to make that leap into a written form is so thoroughly disproven by the archaeological record that it borders on willful ignorance. And at a minimum, it is criminal laziness to put out this type of tripe without bothering to do a fucking Google search. What a clown. And let's talk about cities. Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital, had an estimated population of 200 to 300,000 people when the Spanish arrived in the 16th century. That made it one of the largest cities in the entire world at that time. It had causeways, aqueducts, sewage systems, floating gardens, and there was a market at Tlatelolco that Spanish conquistadors described as larger and better organized than anything that they had ever seen in Europe. The Inca Empire stretched across thousands of miles of the Andes. It maintained that empire with an extensive road network, a system of relay runners for communication, and a bureaucracy that managed food distribution across a vast and geographically diverse territory. Chichen Itza, the Pyramid of the Sun at Teotihuacan, the ancient city of Caral in Peru, which dates to around 2600 BCE and features monumental architecture, irrigation systems, and evidence of social stratification. These aren't footnotes. These are major, well-documented civilizations. The claim that Native Americans were basically stuck in the Stone Age until Europeans showed up and blessed them with all of their knowledge and technology isn't just wrong. It's a colonial myth. And it's exactly the kind of distortion that historians have been working to correct for decades. He's also cherry-picking his timeline in a very revealing way. He says that Native Americans were on this continent for 10 to 30,000 years and never made civilizational strides. But then he turns around and argues that it only took a few thousand years for Christianity to enable the rise of modern science in Europe. The double standard here is obvious. When a non-Western civilization takes a long time to develop, it proves that they were just incapable. They're savages. But when a Western civilization does the same thing, because Christian major modern civilizations took thousands of years to develop, well, that proves how hard and miraculous the process is, and it somehow proves how Christianity itself is the indispensable key to advancement. That's not history. That is, at best, motivated reasoning. And quite frankly, although I wouldn't accuse him of this personally, it borders on racist to try to put this shit in a video. It's really embarrassing.
But let's say you somehow do manage to take those miraculous steps. Science, as we know it, is still an extremely long way off. And to trace its origin and how it came about, we have to go back to the ancient Greeks, which ironically, it was their own reason and cleverness that almost prevented them from finding the right way forward. And keep in mind, by the time they had men of reason and natural philosophy asking the right kinds of questions and eventually coming up with the right kinds of answers, they already had sophisticated political regimes, literature, and the provisions for certain people to dedicate themselves to intellectual pursuits. But there was still one major hurdle that they hadn't jumped, which was how to know if the world and reality was logical or intelligible at all. Because if it's not, experimenting on it to uncover its laws is an expensive waste of time. The problem for them was that the world of the senses, the one they could see, hear, and experience directly every day, didn't seem to be compatible with what their reason told them. So they composed several riddles or dilemmas that seemed to be logically infallible, but deeply incompatible with the common sense experience of the world that they lived in. Unless you can reconcile the world of the senses and the world of reason, you will never make the necessary strides towards something like modern science, which assumes that those things are compatible. So there are quite a few of these kinds of thinkers and schools of thought that I could describe, but for the sake of time, I'll tell you about the one who is probably often...
Now we're into the ancient Greeks, and he makes a point here that's actually worth engaging with. He's right that the Greeks developed sophisticated philosophical and political culture well before they had anything resembling modern science. And he's right that there was a genuine tension between rationalist philosophy and empirical observation. He correctly notes that without confidence that the world is intelligible, that it follows consistent laws, you have no reason to investigate it empirically. That's a real epistemological point. But notice what's absent here. He's about to argue that Christianity resolved this tension, but he hasn't yet acknowledged that the Greeks themselves were already working on it. Aristotle, who he's going to mention later, already made a powerful case for empirical investigation of the natural world. And Aristotle was not a Christian. He died in 322 BCE.
Most cited because nobody could refute his argument, which was Parmenides. Parmenides answered two fundamental questions in a way that, if it had not been overcome, irrationality would have been cemented in its dominance in Western civilization. So first he said that there is only one thing rather than many things, and that this thing is being itself. Because how could there be anything other than being? The only alternative to being is non-being, which can't exist. Therefore, the only thing that does exist is one monolithic being. Secondly, nothing changes. Everything that is stays exactly the same. How do we know? Because only being exists, and what can being change into other than what it already is? Again, non-being, which is impossible. Therefore, the world around us that we perceive with our senses, which appears to have many, many different things, a plurality of things, and which appear to be changing and fluctuating, that's actually just an illusion. So don't trust your senses, because your reason is telling you something different. Now, luckily for Greece and everyone who inherited their tradition, Plato and then Aristotle were able to convincingly answer Parmenides' argument, enough that reason and common sense were restored to a condition of compatibility. And I don't have time to explain in detail what their arguments were in response to him, but for Plato, it was his theory of the forms, which consists in a perfect, unchanging world. And for Aristotle, it was a breakthrough distinction between potentiality and actuality. And the Greco-Roman world thrived as a result under the thought of those two most enduring philosophers of all time, arguably.
So his Parmenides summary is rough, but it's recognizable. Parmenides did argue that change is an illusion and that only being exists. And it's true that Plato and Aristotle both offered responses to this that helped restore the compatibility of reason and experience. His summary of Plato and Aristotle is brief, and honestly, it's a little garbled. Aristotle's distinction between potentiality and actuality is more central to his natural philosophy than he suggests. But the basic point stands. The Greeks worked through this problem themselves. What he's done here, though, is set up a story where the Greeks got to a certain point and then they just hit a wall. And the church came along and pushed them farther and saved the day. But the problem with that story is that it skips over what actually happened between the Greek Golden Age and the medieval church. And what happened is really damn important.
But eventually, the world of antiquity did collapse under the weight of its own success. Like so many before them, like Egypt and Babylon, they rose, they achieved dominance, and eventually declined or collapsed. They had gone as far as any civilization ever and could, and seemingly could. It's like that old meme in which they say, hard times create good men, then good men create good times. But good times create weak men, and then weak men create hard times. This is sort of like the cycle of civilization that is theorized about. But after the fall of Rome, something remained that had never remained before, which was the church. And under the church's direction, civilization and humanity were able to go way further politically, intellectually, and technologically than had ever been done in recorded history. So the church inherited the remnants of the Greco-Roman world after the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. And here's the thing about the church. The stereotypes are popular and persistent, but not consistent with the facts of history.
So he says that after the fall of Rome, something remained that had never remained before, which was the church. He's presenting the church as the primary and essentially unique vehicle through which ancient knowledge was finally preserved. But this is a significant distortion of the actual history. Let's talk about what he left out. The Eastern Roman Empire didn't fall in 476 CE. It kept going for another 1,000 years. Byzantium preserved an enormous body of Greek philosophical and scientific knowledge. Byzantine scholars copied manuscripts, they maintained libraries, and they continued intellectual work throughout the entire medieval period. He doesn't mention Byzantium once. He also doesn't mention that when the Western Roman Empire fell, a lot of that classical knowledge flowed east into the Islamic world. The Abbasid Caliphate, centered in Baghdad, undertook one of history's great translation movements. The House of Wisdom was a major intellectual institution where scholars translated Greek, Persian, and Indian texts into Arabic. Scholars like Al-Kindi and Al-Farabi, Ibn Sina, and Al-Biruni didn't just preserve ancient knowledge. They extended it. They made original contributions to mathematics, astronomy, medicine, optics, and chemistry. The numbers that you use are called Arabic numerals. There's a reason for that, and the reason is not Christianity. The math that you do depends heavily on algebra or al-jabra, which is an Arabic term, and there's a reason for that. And that reason is not Christianity. He's about to acknowledge some of this, and then he'll totally dismiss it. But let's be clear about what we're dealing with. The idea that the medieval church was essentially the lone keeper of the flame of ancient knowledge is just complete and utter bullshit. The story is much more complicated than that. In the Islamic world's contributions weren't just incidental. They were foundational to the European Renaissance that he's so proud of.
The church is accused of being stereotypically anti-reason and intolerant of other cultures. So what would you then expect it to do when the philosophy and writings of antiquity, which were produced by heathens and idolaters, falls under the control of the church? Well, according to the stereotypes, they destroy it, of course. But not only did they not destroy it, they painstakingly cataloged it and preserved it in monastic libraries and ecclesial universities, which the church invented, by the way. And they didn't stop there. They incorporated it into the training of their own clergy as part of their own intellectual tradition. Greek and Roman philosophy became the prerequisite to studying theology. Before you became a Christian theologian, you had to first become a philosopher, which is still the tradition today for priestly training. Because the church recognized that both faith and reason are two ways of knowing what is true, and truth cannot contradict truth. And these weren't peaceful times either. After the fall of Rome left a vacuum of power and law, Europe was then carved up by local warlords who were in constant struggle with one another, which meant that defenseless monasteries where these texts were stored and copied by monk scribes were often ransacked by Vandals and Goths, and then later by Vikings and Muslims. But they were so dedicated to the preservation of that ancient thought that they just picked up the pieces and began their work again, though much of it was lost in the process. Then, by the time we get to the High Middle Ages, another crucial moment occurred when...
So he makes a few claims here that are worth looking at. First, he says that the church preserved ancient philosophical texts when they could have destroyed them. He frames this as evidence that the church was not anti-reason. And look, fair enough. I don't know who he is claiming in his straw man that the stereotype is that the church got rid of all these texts. I have never heard anyone claim that. But the monastic preservation of manuscripts absolutely is a real historical contribution. That's not a myth. And quite frankly, I think it's a straw man to imply anything otherwise. But the framing is doing a hell of a lot of work here. The choice wasn't simply preserve or destroy. The church also actively suppressed texts. It burned what it considered to be heretical works, and it exercised significant control over what knowledge was permissible. The preservation of Aristotle by the church was itself controversial within the church. There were serious debates about whether pagan philosophy was compatible with Christian theology at all. Some church authorities condemned Aristotelian works outright. The University of Paris banned certain Aristotelian texts in the 13th century. Second, he says that the church invented universities. Now, this is unfortunately a very common apologetic claim, and it's at best a massive, significant oversimplification. It's true that the earliest European universities, like Bologna, Paris, Oxford, they emerged in the 12th and 13th centuries, and they did have ties to the church. But to say that the church invented universities ignores a whole hell of a lot. The ancient world had institutions of higher learning. The academy, founded by Plato, the Lyceum, founded by Aristotle, the Library of Alexandria had an associated research institution, the Museion, that functioned something like a research university. The great Indian university at Nalanda predated European universities by centuries. The Islamic world had its own institutions of higher learning, including the Nizamiya madrasa system established in the 11th century. The medieval European university was a genuine institutional innovation. But to credit the church with inventing the concept of higher education is just to ignore thousands of years of prior history across multiple continents. And third, he mentions that monasteries were ransacked by Vandals and Goths, and then later by Vikings and Muslims. That last group deserves comment. Framing Muslims here as raiders alongside Vikings, when the Islamic world was simultaneously one of the primary centers of intellectual preservation and advancement, is misleading at best.
Aristotle's writings were rediscovered and circulated again both in Christendom and in the Islamic world, which created a bit of a crisis for both of those civilizations because much of Aristotle's thought, at first glance, seemed to clash with revelation and the contemporary understanding of the Bible. It almost sounded atheistic to some because of its focus on the physical world and the need for observation and experimentation in order to know the nature of material things. In Christendom, largely thanks to the efforts of St. Albert the Great and St. Thomas Aquinas, Aristotle was welcomed into the Christian intellectual tradition. In the Muslim world, he was resisted by people like al-Ash'ari and al-Ghazali, who didn't like Aristotle's view that physical things can be causes all on their own. Fire actually heats things up, water cools them down. They thought this very scientific way of thinking endangered God's providence and omnipotence as the cause of all things.
So now we are at the reintroduction of Aristotle in the High Middle Ages. And this is where he makes the claim that's central to his whole thesis. He says that when Aristotle's works were rediscovered, the Islamic world largely rejected them, while the Christian West embraced them. And he's about to use that to argue that Christianity, not Islam, is what made modern science possible in the first place. And this is where the argument gets seriously distorted. His characterization of Islamic thinkers like al-Ash'ari and al-Ghazali as simply rejecting Aristotle is a massive oversimplification. Al-Ghazali's relationship with Aristotelian philosophy was complex. He wrote the incoherence of the philosophers to critique certain Aristotelian and Neoplatonic ideas that he thought conflicted with Islamic theology. But he didn't reject logic or rational inquiry wholesale. He was a trained logician who used Aristotelian methods to critique Aristotelian metaphysics. That is a nuanced philosophical position, not a blanket rejection of reason. And the bigger problem with his argument is this. Who do you think transmitted Aristotle's works to the medieval European universities in the first place? It was Islamic scholars. Ibn Rushd, known in the West as Averroes, wrote such extensive commentaries on Aristotle that he was simply called the commentator by medieval European scholastics. Aquinas himself, whom he's about to credit with integrating Aristotle into Christian thought, was working with Arabic translations and commentaries. The Aristotle that Thomas Aquinas encountered was largely the Aristotle that had been preserved, translated, and annotated by Islamic scholars. You can't give Christianity credit for embracing Aristotle while ignoring the Islamic scholars who preserved and transmitted Aristotle in the first place. That's not history. That's just selective credit taking.
So in the end, the Muslim world largely rejected Aristotle, while the Christian West embraced him. And the trajectory of those two civilizations is hard to ignore. The West eventually went on to the Renaissance, modern science, the age of discovery, and industrialization. The Islamic world, by contrast, largely stagnated. So without the popularization of Aristotle, you don't make that last step to modern science. And without the universities that the church invented and funded, you don't get the class of specialized academics who can take Aristotle's thought further than he or the ancient world were able to take it. This is also why Catholic clergy as a group are easily the most prominent among scientists through history, especially in the Middle Ages, so much so that they have their own page on Wikipedia, which you have to navigate alphabetically because there's so many of them. According to historian of science Lawrence Principe, the Catholic Church was probably the largest single and longest-term patron of science in history. Without that generosity and ability to value intellectual endeavor, you would never get to the point in which a civilization can make that last stride into what modernity and people like Ricky Gervais just take for granted as if it was inevitable. History shows us repeatedly it was not inevitable, and the fact it arose under the kinds of conditions that only the church had created isn't just an awkward correlation for contemporary atheists. It's the reason.
So here's his conclusion about the words of Ricky Gervais. The Islamic world stagnated. The Christian West went on to the Renaissance, modern science, and industrialization. Therefore, Christianity was indispensable to the rise of modern science. First of all, let's take the Islamic stagnation claim first, because it's doing enormous work in this argument. The idea that the Islamic world simply stagnated after the medieval period is a contested and, frankly, grossly oversimplified narrative. There are historians who push back on it significantly. The Ottoman Empire maintained sophisticated intellectual and scientific traditions well into the early modern period. But more importantly, even granting that the Islamic world did fall behind the West in scientific development after the 15th century, he hasn't identified the cause. He assumes that the cause was the rejection of Aristotle, but historians have proposed many other explanations. The Mongol devastation of Baghdad in 1258, which destroyed the House of Wisdom and set back Islamic scholarship by generations. The economic disruption caused by the shift in trade routes after the Age of Discovery, political fragmentation, and the different institutional structures of Islamic versus European scholarship. These are complex historical questions, and the simple story that he's telling just ignores all of them. Now let's look at the bigger logical problem. He's arguing that Christianity was indispensable to modern science because modern science emerged in Christian Europe. But this is a classic correlation-causation error. Modern science also emerged in a specific geographic region with particular access to trade networks, natural resources, and accumulated agricultural surplus. Does that mean that geography caused modern science? Modern science emerged after the printing press was invented. Does the printing press get credit? Modern science emerged in societies that had benefited from centuries of Islamic mathematical and astronomical knowledge. Does Islam get the credit? Modern science evolved in countries that had a rich history of beer production. Does that mean that beer gets the credit? The question isn't whether Christianity was present when modern science emerged. It was. We all know that. The question is whether Christianity was causally necessary. And to prove that, you need to show that these specific Christian theological commitments, not just institutional structures, not just the church's role as a patron, but specifically Christian theology, somehow produced something that no other set of ideas could have possibly produced. And he hasn't done that at all. In fact, he's failed miserably at it. He's shown that Christianity was present. Congratulations. Everybody already knew that, but that's not the same as saying that Christianity caused the rise of modern science. And let's come back to Ricky Gervais, or Ricky Gervais, as everyone else knows him. His original argument was about the nature of scientific knowledge, that if you destroyed all science books, scientists would eventually rediscover the same facts because the laws of nature don't change. They just would need to be rediscovered. That argument still stands. Our host here never really addressed it. He spent 14 minutes talking about the sociological conditions that enabled the development of science. And that can at times be an interesting historical conversation, but it doesn't touch the epistemological point that Gervais was making in the first place. Gervais wasn't saying that science was inevitable in a given civilization at a given time. He was saying that the content of scientific knowledge, the actual raw facts about nature itself, will be rediscovered wherever and whenever people investigate nature carefully and systematically. Because nature is consistent. Water boils at the same temperature at sea level, whether you're a Christian monk or a Muslim astronomer or a Greek philosopher or an Inca engineer. That's what Ricky Gervais was saying, and it's still true. For all of his blather and all of his ethnocentric, insensitive lies, Brian here never even bothered to fully address on any level the core argument from Ricky Gervais in the first place. You see, what Brian never even attempts to address is this. There's a simple theoretical way that we can look at this. Even if we know that every scientist who has ever lived has been a Christian, even if we know that Christianity as an institution actively pushed toward scientific development, even if we know that something embedded in Christianity somehow drives the quest for scientific knowledge, that still does not mean on any empirical level that if you took Christianity away, that science just wouldn't happen. Even if we were to grant somehow that Christianity is a net benefit to the overall advancement of science, that does not prove in any way, shape, or form that if you took Christianity out of the equation, that those poor, ignorant, heathen dolts who didn't have the benefit of Yahweh and Jebus smiling down upon them couldn't possibly, at any point in their long history, come up with any of the same scientific discoveries that were discovered in Western universities during a largely Christian-dominated era. The history of science is genuinely fascinating, and the church's role in it is genuinely real and complicated, to be frank. There are legitimate things to say about how Christian theology shaped the assumptions that early European scientists brought to their work. Historians like David Lindbergh and Ronald Numbers have done serious scholarship on this question. But this video is not that. This video is not even intellectually coherent. This video gives you a history where Native Americans never built cities or wrote things down, where Islamic scholars did nothing but block progress, and where the entire arc of human civilization leads inevitably to the conclusion that Christianity was indispensable. And that is not history at all. That's just apologetics dressed up in some history-looking cloak. And the tell is exactly what we saw here. When the facts don't cooperate, they get changed. The Aztec cities disappear. The Islamic translators disappear. The Byzantine scholars disappear. And what's left is a nice, clean story where he can tell all of his Christian buddies that Christianity saves the day. Unfortunately, it's also a ridiculous set of lies. Don't buy them. Thank you for joining me here on another episode of Breakdowns and Beatdowns. As always, I want to give special thanks to my members. I appreciate your support and patronage so much. If anyone wants to correct me on any of this or argue about anything that I've said, or just chime in and let me know what I got right, we are live streaming now every Tuesday starting at 5 p.m. Central Time. We usually go quite late. You are free to join. You can just watch and hang out in the chat, or you can call in if you are so inclined, especially if you think I got something wrong. I would love to hear your counterpoints. I hope to see all of you on future videos. Hopefully I see you on the Tuesday night, 5 p.m. Central live streams. But until I do, lo, I say unto you, stay skeptical.